Section 18 of Medieval Contributions to Modern Civilization. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Medieval Contributions to Modern Civilization. Section 18 Education, Part 2 by J. W. Adamson. The university is a peculiarly medieval institution in point of origin. Athens, Alexandria, Rhodes, and other centers of the ancient civilization possessed places of higher education which attracted young men from distant lands. But they had little in common with universities as we now know them, on their administrative side especially. The division of teachers and of students into faculties, the ordered systems of curricula and of corresponding degrees, the government of the university society, are all forms of development which took shape in medieval times. The very name university, universitas or guild, is a reminder of the fact, since guilds were a characteristic feature of medieval society. The technical name for a university was Studium Generale, within which the universitas or guild, whether of teachers or of scholars, built up the university life. The earliest universities, Bologna, Paris, Oxford, were never founded in any formal sense, and the date of their origin is uncertain. By the last quarter of the 12th century, all three were recognized studia generalia. Cambridge held that status in the opening years of the 13th century. But advanced teaching existed certainly at Bologna, Paris, and Oxford, possibly also at Cambridge, before those times. For example, Paris is associated with the scholastic philosophy and theology of Peter Abelard, teaching which, by attracting crowds of students, made inevitable the establishment of a studium generale and a teachers' guild. Yet Abelard died in 1142. Colleges and universities are another medieval invention. In their early period, the studia generalia confined themselves almost entirely to the business of teaching. Board and lodging were matters personal to the teacher and student. But circumstances did not allow this easy attitude to be maintained for long. The great majority of the teachers and students were sojourners amidst a town population rarely friendly and frequently hostile. As a rule, both teachers and students were poor. The former derived their living from their teaching and its appurtenances. Usually destitute of ecclesiastical benefits, they were, though clerks, virtually professional lay teachers, not as a class especially loved by the ecclesiastical authorities. Some boarded and lodged students. The earliest university statutes, Paris, 1215, noted the relationship between clerks and those not being members of the university, who let lodgings to students. In course of time, hostels for poor students were established by charitable persons. The advent of the friars, Franciscans, and Dominican introduced the conventual house, with its common life in chapel, hall, and dormitory, its library and tutors. The object lesson had an immediate effect. In the second half of the 13th century, the first colleges were founded at Paris, the Sorbonne, Oxford, Merton, and Cambridge, Peterhouse. As is well known, The 12th century saw a great revival of learning which affected medical and mathematical science, philosophy, law, and letters. The French schools seemed to be divided in their interest between letters as at Chartres and philosophy as at Paris. But the great and popular instructors at Paris taught dialect, logic, theology, in a word, scholasticism. And the practice of Paris determined that of most universities for the succeeding 4 or 5 centuries. Yet scholasticism at Paris and law at Bologna implied at least a minimum of grammar. The literary foundation remained everywhere. It is true that what we should today call scientific subjects were included amongst the liberal arts, and natural philosophy was read as part of the course for the degree in arts. But the method of study preserved its bookish character. Science was learned from encyclopedias, works based on Greek originals known through Latin translations. These elementary manuals had in some cases been compiled for the purpose of preserving the debris of ancient learning, sometimes expressly to make it unnecessary to consult the original sources. In either case, it was science founded not upon observation and experiment, but upon authority, in harmony with the legal and theological methods of the day. This remained true in spite of the friars Roger Bacon and Albertus Magnus, and other early students of science as now understood. The art of printing is a contribution of the first rank made by the Middle Ages to those which followed. It furnishes some striking illustrations of the cardinal defects of education, as then practiced, namely the unquestioning deference to authority, with a correspondingly slow, almost imperceptible advance in the content of studies. The 3 standard books on the liberal arts, which were in use throughout the medieval period, were the work of Martianus Capella, 5th century, Cassiodorus, 6th century, and Isidore of Seville, 7th century, respectively. They were in the nature of brief and rudimentary encyclopedias. Of the first, 8 editions were printed between 1499 and 1599. The second was printed as late as 1580. Isidore's Origins, which was compiled in order to make it unnecessary to consult pagan originals, appeared in 6 or 7 editions between 1472 and 1577. The Arithmetica of Boethius held its place as an authoritative textbook for 1,000 years after its first appearance in 502. The printed editions issued after 1488 were innumerable. The standard textbook of universal history was a compilation from the Bible, Livy, Tacitus, and from earlier compilers, made about the year 417 by Orosius. As its title implied, 7 books of histories against the pagans, its purpose was to maintain that the divine providence was manifested in the disasters which befell the empire in consequence of its paganism, a type of controversy which was ripe in the 5th century. Not unnaturally, the adherents of the old religion retorted by blaming the empire's conversion to Christianity. The well-known universal elementary textbook of grammar in the medieval period was the work of a 4th-century teacher, Aelius Donatus, on the 8 parts of speech. It was one of the earliest books to be printed more than a millennium later. Another favorite elementary grammar book was the Doctrinale of Alexander de Villa Dei, produced about the year 1200. There were 260 editions in whole or in part printed between 1470 and 1520. It should be noted that all the works above named survived beyond the close of the period 500–1500, and that they were textbooks, not great literary classics. That is, they survived not in virtue of their purely literary merits, which in truth were few, but as exponents of knowledge as it existed at the times of their publication. Here we have the characteristics failing of medieval education as it was practiced in schools and universities, namely an overweening respect for authority, as set forth in the written word. The consequence was either comparative stagnation or sterilization. These books made no progress beyond the stage at which something had been saved from the ruin of Roman civilization, and this was in spite of the presence of much educational machinery, both of institutions and of administration. It needed the revival of classical learning during the last century or so of our period to effect a drastic change which the genius of individual men had failed to bring out. In the early days of universities, owing to the comparative scarcity of books and the great cost of classical and other standard works, much of the teaching took the form of lecturing to large audiences. The lectures were very frequently dictation lessons for the same reasons. The practice became traditional and was continued when conditions made it less excusable. For example, the University of Louvain, founded in 1425, employed disputation and the dictation of texts, glosses, and commentaries as late as 1475. Students memorized their notes and, like schoolboys, repeated them to their instructors. Disputation grew out of the wholesome method of teaching by dialogue, by conversation, by question and answer. The medieval textbooks respected the convention by putting the questions in the mouths of the learners. Thus, in the Donat, it is the pupil who asks, "How many parts of speech are there?" Scholasticism in theology and philosophy was elaborated by the method of dialectic or disputation, and scholasticism directed the practice of the universities, since the formal exercises leading to a degree were steps in the training of a university teacher. It was natural that disputation should play a prominent part in those exercises. The method afforded a welcome relief from the tedium of the lecture. So long as it was genuine, it was a better form of teaching since it required the pupil's active participation. Later times kept up the tradition, but turned the disputation into a farce. We learn from Stowe, the antiquary, that as late as 1535–40, when he was at school, London boys on St. Bartholomew's Day disputed publicly in Smithfield. The only available material lay in the grammar book, and it is safe to infer that exceptions and exceptions to exceptions were freely drawn upon by the disputants to discomfit opponents. In that case, these schoolboy wranglings had their share in creating the belief that exceptions were of far more importance than rules. The institutions thus far considered concerned themselves with learning Latin, reading books written in Latin, teaching in Latin, and this irrespective of the mother tongue of teacher or taught. In other words, the instruction which they gave belonged to the spheres of what we now call secondary and higher or university education. Did the Middle Ages make no contribution to popular education, to teaching rudiments in the vernacular without reference to any alien tongue? The answer is, in the first place, that public instruction in reading, writing, and summing originated within that period under economic pressure. It is a mere prejudice, the child of ignorance, which ascribes the origin of this kind of instruction to the influence of Luther, Knox, Calvin, and others, whose principles logically required every child to be able at least to read. Principles are not infrequently in advance of practice. Elementary instruction of this kind existed long before the Reformation outside the systems fostered by the Church and the universities. In strictness, it was not the business of the schools to instruct in the 3 R's, that part of mathematics now found in arithmetic books, so far as it then existed, was regarded as a practical art, useful chiefly to tradesmen. Reading meant the ability to read Latin words. The school had no use for the former, and it very frequently expected the pupil to bring the latter ability with him, just as he brought the ability to talk. But this strict view could not always be maintained with respect to reading and writing, arts which found their way into grammar schools and song schools. In the later Middle Ages, these often were part of the studies of the lower forms occupied by the petties. There were also other and less formal ways, chiefly under private teachers, by which children, girls as well as boys, learned to read and less often to write. The origin of the elementary school, as such, is to be found in the demand made by commerce and industry for junior clerks and for workmen who could read and write the vernacular and, in fewer instances, make out or at least understand a bill. Such schools, quite distinct from grammar or song schools, grew up in the great commercial and industrial centers during the 14th century in Italy and in Germany. They appeared in England in the following century, when the country passed from an agricultural to an industrial and commercial status. While the Church had no special interest in this purely utilitarian instruction, it was not unmindful of the education of the great majority of the people. Councils and individual bishops admonished parish priests to keep schools in which all commerce might be taught gratis. The object in view is expressed as follows in a papal document of the second quarter of the 13th century. Let every parish priest have his clerk to sing and to read the epistle and lesson, a man able to keep school. A gloss adds, to teach children the psalter and singing, and let the priest admonish his parishioners to send their sons to church to learn the faith, and that he may chastely educate them. The purpose, then, is religious and liturgical. And it is religious because it was held that education must be a religious education, or conversely, that religion is education. We can very easily be unfair to our ancestors on this point. After all, it is no small part of true education to teach and to train a man to act up to his duty to God and his fellows. The great expansion of knowledge, especially of scientific knowledge, during modern times, tempts us to attach more than its due importance to knowledge in a scheme of education. But these parish schools had possibilities of development. They were open to girls as well as to boys, and their object was not so rigidly stated that there was no room for a particular interpretation of it by a given priest or his parishioners. In France, certainly that development took place. The priests or parish schools, especially those in the great towns, became in due course charity schools, which taught reading and writing, sometimes also summing, and more rarely, drawing. But again, we are unfair to the medieval world if we regard its universities and schools as its only educational institutions. Apart from the parish schools, the medieval schools were addressed to the needs of the scholar or professional man, the theologian, lawyer, or doctor. Their business was not with girls or women, but with boys and men whose minds were of the scholarly type, an elite, not of birth or of wealth, but of a certain type of capacity, the type which is apt to arrogate the term intellectual to itself. It did not include a very powerful body of persons, women as well as men. The man of action, the soldier, the great landowner, the sovereign prince, and their respective womenfolk received little or no help from grammar school or university, though it must not be assumed that the men and boys of these social classes never resorted to either. The needs of these men and women of affairs were not coincident with those of the clerkly person. Farther, while one sort of human excellence fitted the scholar for his career, these men and women could apply many sorts of excellence in their daily lives. Moreover, they were in a position to give some effect to their varied ideals. The chivalric education, as it is called, was given within the domestic circles of the royal court, the castle, and the feudal or semi feudal household of the territorial magnate. The pupils, in the first instance, were the wards of the head of the house, but their number was increased by the sons and daughters of his curator vassals and of others of similar rank. The system of chivalry was certainly developed in the 11th century, but its beginning can be noted as early as the 8th. The chivalric education existed down to the close of our period, when it came under the influence of the classical revival and passed into the doctrine of courtesy, the body of principles which governed the nurture of the socially distinguished for 3 centuries at least. Under purely feudal conditions, the chivalric education of the boy was largely devoted to physical exercise, to the management of arms, to horsemanship, sport, and the outdoor life generally. The tournament was often the occasion of great international gatherings of men and women who, irrespective of nationality, were practiced in the etiquette of the 30 and who could not fail to educate and be educated by the daily intercourse with their fellows. But the education of chivalry also included in its sphere the social amenities, behavior in hall and bower, table manners, and indoor games. Girls and women shared this with boys and men, while the girls and women also received a practical training in the government of the household and in simple medicine and surgery. Unlike the schools and universities, the chivalric form of education held vernaculars in honor. The early literatures of France and of England, especially, are full of the romances and poetry which helped to shape the culture of dame and knight. In its later phase, the doctrine of courtesy, the chivalric education laid stress upon modern languages, literatures, and history, and upon modern studies as the extension of knowledge gave them birth. In this form, courtly education had a sounder claim to be called humanist than could be put forward for some types of upbringing to which that term is applied without hesitation. In sum, the Middle Ages made a substantial contribution to the modern course of instruction, and in so doing it transmitted a knowledge of the ancient civilization, so much of which had disappeared by the 5th century. The medieval curriculum distinguished between professional studies and general culture, the latter being represented by the Faculty of Arts in the universities. The conception of a general education as a necessary preliminary to such professional studies as theology, law, and medicine became established at Oxford during the 13th century. The Middle Ages gave us public instruction on the great scale, chiefly secondary in character, but elementary, also meaning by the word instruction confined to the 3 R's and the mother tongue. The local administration of this public instruction dates from the early times of the period AD 500 1500. Last, but by no means least, the ideas latent in the practice of knightly education may be applied directly to national systems of universal compulsory instruction. Indeed, these latter will both fail so long as they ignore the root principle of chivalric education, the principle that every type of human capacity calls for cultivation. It is not enough that a nation educate its scholars only. Negatively, this same period of history demonstrates the abuse of authority in education, an abuse especially harmful in the field of physical knowledge. Medieval science was credulous and superstitious, and without examination repeated the mistakes as well as the truths of an earlier age. This, however, is medieval education at its worst. At its best, it trained men to a critical temper, which in the end proved the undoing of much which was characteristic of itself. J. W. Adamson. End of section 18.
Section 19 of Medieval Contributions to Modern Civilization. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Medieval Contributions to Modern Civilization. Society, Part 1 by Hilda Johnstone. A certain French historian, Monsieur Paul Viollet, wrote a well known book on the history of the political and administrative institutions of France, mainly during the Middle Ages. That work is in 3 volumes, and its text, exclusive of index, table of contents, and so on, fills more than 1400 closely printed pages. Its gradual publication extended over a period of 13 years. Its scope is wide, including church and state, royal, seigneurial, and municipal institutions, machinery for peace and machinery for war, finance, justice, legislation. The author of such a book not only has abundant material for forming an historical creed of his own, but indeed, if he be worthy of the name of historian at all, must inevitably do so. What then is the belief to which Monsieur Violet's labors have led him? We issue, he said, from the Middle Ages. The roots of our modern society lie deep in them. What we are, in great measure, because of the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages are alive in us, they are alive all round us. When 9 years after the completion of this first work, its author published another relating to a more modern period, his preface shows that further researchers had only confirmed him in his views. The Middle Ages were fertile, he says. They were creative. Whatever is most living and most resisting in the national character is inherited. Modern society strikes its roots deep into the past. The dead are alive in it. That is a point of view which has been held very generally by historians. There is a classical, if hackneyed, example to be found on this side of the channel in the much quoted sentences from Bishop Stubbs' preface to his Constitutional History. The roots of the present lie deep in the past, and nothing in the past is dead to the man who would learn how the present came to be what it is. The task imposed on me is to examine such a point of view, especially in relation to society, to the life of man as a social being, a member of a community. What does modern society owe to the Middle Ages? What link binds a man's life in the 20th century to that of his forefathers in the 13th? That is no new question. It has been asked again and again. Historians, in particular, perhaps have thought about it, since to them, whose minds dwell much in the past, who, as Sir Thomas Browne says, daily command the view of so many imperial faces. Analogies and contrasts and speculations must constantly be suggesting themselves. But there are few of us who have not, at some time or other, with more or less seriousness, with more or less knowledge, with more or less genuine desire to seek truth, asked ourselves similar questions. And to them, no doubt, we have found answers varying as widely as our own temperaments. The answers most frequently returned stand at one or the other of two opposite poles. One set of inquirers comes to the conclusion that modern society owes nothing to the Middle Ages except an instructive object lesson in what to avoid. The pillory medieval ignorance, superstition, brutality, and violence, the discomforts of medieval life, and the imperfection of medieval manners, or they patronize the Middle Ages, and while denying them the right to a man's full stature, are willing to admit the charm of their childlike innocence and their skill in constructing beautifully such toys as please them. The other set of inquirers takes a directly opposite line. Society as we find it now, they say, is unwholesome, overcomplicated, distressed, and impotent. Society in the Middle Ages was regulated, finished, secure in its own outlook, satisfied with its works and ways. Salvation lies in a return to the past. The world of today is covered with the hot lava of an eruption. We must make it anew with its cool streams and green hillsides as it was before it underwent that ordeal by fire. Among the enemies or patrons of medieval civilization, there are undoubtedly some great names. If you read, for example, the Lowell Lectures, which the late provost of Trinity College Dublin delivered at Boston some years ago, you will find that not content with describing to his American audience very finely, very justly, very impressively the services rendered to modern civilization by the Greek genius, he constantly, by implication or by direct assertion, derides and belittles the contributions made by the Middle Ages. He speaks of the way in which the gloomy splendor of Dante, the mightiest outcome of the Middle Ages, had put out the cheerfulness and light of Greek life, even as Virgil understood them, with a cruel and relentless creed. He contrasts the Gothic cathedral, the ideal gloom, as he says, in which to worship a relentless God and a tortured Christ, with the Renaissance palace, a place of light and gladness. Dr. Mahaffy was a great scholar, though in other than medieval fields. So strong a prejudice in a trained mind is rare. But there are hundreds of people who paint contrasts just as vivid without having any basis of scholarship on which to rest them. Their main interest is in the world in which they are alive. Possibly until the classical tradition in education fades entirely away, they may continue to admit that to the making of that world there went something glorious that was Greece and something grand that was Rome. But the Middle Ages, the 1,000 years between the 5th and the 15th century, represent to them a period in which men's works were unproductive and men's thoughts incomprehensible, a period of whose whole character they are vaguely and faintly suspicious. One of the disciples of Guild Socialism devotes a whole chapter in his most recent book to what he calls the conspiracy against medievalism. Among a certain class of writers, he says, it is the custom to designate as medieval anything which they do not understand or of which they do not approve, quite regardless of the issue as to whether it actually existed in the Middle Ages or not. The accusation may stand if it is modified. There is no conspiracy, surely. There is nothing so definite, no such armed enemy to detect and arrest. What there is indifference, vague terminology, and uninformed repetition of meaningless phrases. Even a slight acquaintance at first hand with the Middle Ages, as they really were, ought to destroy generalizations so sweeping. Let us turn then to the other set of inquirers, those to whom the medieval construction of society represents a lost ideal. That school of thought began with Ruskin. William Morris carried on the tradition, and today the Guild Socialists have taken up the torch. It's only quite recently that most of us have added Guild Socialism to our vocabulary of political terms. And we are apt to forget that the views of the Guild Socialists, propagated vigorously since the war, were conceived long before the war and are linked very closely with the whole process of thought which started in Ruskin's lifetime. One of the earliest expositions of Guild Socialism was set forth in 1906 in a little square book which, with its decent coat of dark blue buckram, its wide margins, firm paper, and admirable type, recalls, even in its physical appearance, the works of William Morris. There is a much more intimate mental connection. The modern flame indeed burns with a harsher and more glaring light than Ruskin's, but it is fed by the same fuel. Time has developed an attitude of mind into a political creed, and the social crisis, hastened by the war, has led its exponents to offer their theory as a practical solution of present ills. But the spirit that informs the dogma has been the same throughout. Broadly speaking, the idea of the guild socialists is to reorganize modern industry on lines similar to those which they believe existed in the Middle Ages. They select as most characteristic of medieval society the organization of guilds, and guilds they would restore in the world of today. But as they admit, such guilds would differ from their medieval predecessors in at least two important respects. In the first place, their organization would be national, not local. In the second, their basis would be the trade unions, which have no historical continuity with the medieval guilds and are in some ways markedly contrasted with them, since they are societies of workers, not of masters, have no monopoly in their respective trades, and take no responsibility for the quality of the wares they produce. The Guild Socialist movement, then, is in the main economic, and its most important aspect lies altogether outside the scope of the present lecture. But the advocates of the movement would be the first to claim that it involves wide social issues. It has been well described, says one of them, as a religion, an art, a philosophy with the economic feet. The majority of people today, he says, elsewhere, feeling that the tendency of modern civilization is to add more to the sorrow than to the joy of life, are beginning to ask themselves what Carlyle and Ruskin were asking themselves 50 years ago. Whither modern civilization goeth? The failure of modern society to realize itself will result in an effort toward finding lost roads. The people will come to connect the golden age with the past again rather than with the future. A reverence for the past, then, is the hope of the future. No medieval historian is likely to belittle the work of Ruskin and of Morris. He must recognize in them preeminently two qualities: complete sincerity and a passion for beauty. They led a crusade where it was sorely needed and they won some bitter fights. They left the world lovelier than they found it. Surely that may be their epitaph, of which they need not be ashamed. And in their modern disciples too, there is the same earnestness, the same revolt against squalor and ugliness, the same idealism. Yet, even the medieval historian, indeed perhaps particularly the medieval historian, is driven reluctantly to criticize a certain unhistorical and artificial outlook in this school, to which it might seem at first sight that his sympathies would be so warmly attracted. Many of its disciples are medievalists by instinct rather than by training, and their attitude is the result of a combination of natural affinities with carefully cultivated tastes. The former often led them nearer to truth than the latter. William Morris was closer in type to his medieval forebears when Burne-Jones found him, quote, embedded in iron, dancing with rage and roaring, end quote, because the visor of a helmet he was trying on had come down and refused to go up, than when Roseate visited his house in Red Lion Square and discovered him surrounded by, quote, intensely medieval furniture, end quote, and quote, chairs such as Barbarossa might have sat in, end quote. The historian who reads the works of this school is constantly brought up short by the unreality of the picture presented to him. When he finds William Morris talking of London, small and white and clean, he remembers medieval London as he has met it in record and chronicle, with its muddy lanes and filthy gutters, its dirt and disease, its gates bristling with the heads of criminals, its jostling and rioting crowds. When Mr. A.J. Penty tells him that bureaucracy was a peculiarly Roman institution and hardly existed in the Middle Ages, he thinks of English constitutional history as it has been rewritten during the last 20 years in the light of fuller knowledge of the records of these bureaucratic offices which managed or mismanaged the affairs of medieval kings and kingdoms. The enthusiasts tell him that, according to the old conception, art, religion, ideas, integrity of work, the pursuit of perfection were looked upon as the serious things of life, while business and money making were subservient things, considered relatively unimportant, for men had a reverence for the truth and abhorrence for the false. The historian would be glad to believe it, but if he is to preserve his own respect for truth, he must say sadly that such a theory of an altruistic and ideal society is utterly at variance with the Middle Ages as he sees them in their writings and their doings. There is no such simple formula to explain their infinite variety. He must say rather with Sabatier that the Middle Ages had every vice and every virtue. Every vice except vulgarity, every virtue except moderation. But it is time that we forsook destructive for constructive criticism. If the contribution of the Middle Ages to modern society was neither to act as a dreadful warning nor to serve as an ideal for imitation, what was it? It was, I think, something gradual and rather elusive. It consisted in a long and slow process of historical development which prepared the way for the structure of modern society. It can be best represented by that favorite metaphor of whose use by historians I have already quoted two examples. Modern society strikes its roots deep into the past, said Monsieur Violet. The roots of the present lie deep in the past, said Stubbs. That is a very exact metaphorical description and can be pressed and elaborated in a way few metaphors could bear. The Middle Ages produced, in lavish quantity, a flora all their own. What it was like, we know partly by description, partly by rare survival, partly by certain specimens artificially preserved. Many of its characteristic examples died out altogether. A gorgeous blossom of theory, like the Empire, for example, weighed down and snapped a stem of practice too slender to uphold it. Fruits that had seemed at first tempting and sustaining became in the end insipid or even poisonous. Feudalism, for instance, first became the mere shadow of itself in chivalry and then ceased altogether to meet man's needs. Some trees grew so tall that other life near them was stunted and stifled. So it was with the world power of the papacy. By the end of the medieval period, what had once been a fair garden was rank and in confusion. Natural decay, the neglect of the cultivator, the tramplings of enemies, the thefts of the greedy, the strong pushing of weeds among the flowers had played havoc with what was at first sweet smelling, orderly, and vigorous. Clearing and burning followed before new seeds could be set. But, and here is my point, it was into the old soil that those seeds were dropped, and the soil was richer, warmer, and more fertile than raw, uncultivated ground. Moreover, in its very substance were the remnants of the plants which had sprung from it. The new roots spread themselves in the mould of centuries. And further, even while the displaced plants were still in full vigor, they had had beside them seedlings different in type from the parent tree. Now that the clearance had been made, these had their chance and soon were spreading their flowers so gaily to the sunshine that men failed to recognize in them the offspring of the plants they had destroyed. The fact was that all through the Middle Ages, two processes were going on. One was immediately constructive, and by it was made the prevailing type of civilization which we call medieval, and which reached its most complete form during the 12th and 13th centuries. To meet the practical needs of life, it evolved feudalism, and with feudalism, a society in which men were ranged in order of privilege according to their greater or smaller share in that chief wealth, the land. That method of construction produced a world in which large groups of human beings were inarticulate and unnoticed, blotted out from historical view by the commanding figures of earls, barons, and knights who stood in front of them. The only lay type we know well in feudal society seems extraordinarily remote from anything familiar to us today. The duties, prejudices, recreations, code of honor, and works of piety of the average feudal baron seem as different from those which present themselves to the average man of this age as the feudal castle is different from the modern house. The immediate process then constructed something unfamiliar to us, which has passed away. Yet, what we are is based on what we were, and even with that vanished civilization, we have more links than we always realize. That is the first part of my metaphor, the soil in which the roots are spread. The second process, which it is easy to overlook, was going on side by side with the other, even in the heart of the Middle Ages. There never was a time when the order of society, which we call medieval, was as consistent, as unchallenged, as complete as it looks to us when given a false unity and security by our own remoteness from it. Experiment and criticism were unceasing. Theory and practice never closely fitted each other. Absolute uniformity was unknown. Again and again in the Middle Ages, more and more as we look closely into them, we shall find suggestions and sayings and actions too which strike us as amazingly modern. That they do strike us in that way is because we have that innocent and universal conceit with which man in every age has regarded his own as the touchstone of all the rest. We reject what is unlike our own world in the world of the Middle Ages as antiquated and alien. What is like our own, we regard as the happy prophecy of better things vouchsafed to a few chosen spirits. A more historical view would be to see in such examples the manifestations of a second process, less immediately successful, working beside the first, a minority beside a majority. The minority is produced by the age it lives in as much as the majority, and its theories or its practice, if eventually results come of them, are just as much part of the creative faculty of that age. End of section 19. Section 20 of Medieval Contributions to Modern Civilization. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Medieval Contributions to Modern Civilization. Society, Part 2 by Hilda Johnstone. Let me illustrate my general view of the medieval contribution to modern society by taking a particular instance. Selecting from the most modern of ages, that in which we live, the newest social phenomenon we can find, let us examine it in the light of medieval theory and practice. There is nothing much newer in England's life today than the removal by law of women's disqualifications from sharing to the full in the obligations and privileges long confined to men. There has been an immense and general upheaval of opinion as to women and their place in the world, and it has taken this practical shape. So much for 1920. What would 1220 or 1320 have thought about it? The general theory of the Middle Ages undoubtedly conceived of woman's position in society as completely subordinate. Here, St. Thomas Aquinas, greatest of medieval teachers, supreme embodiment of the medieval spirit. The woman is subject to the man on account of the weakness of her nature, both of mind and of body. Man is the beginning of woman and her end, just as God is the beginning and end of every creature. Woman is in subjection according to the law of nature, but a slave is not. Finally, and perhaps most astonishing of all, children ought to love their father more than their mother. Much medieval history shows us women accepting and endorsing that official estimate of their importance. Take, for example, the case of a lady who in 1301 was prioress of the Cistercian nunnery at Whitstones on the north side of the city of Worcester. Archbishop Winchelsea in that year was about to undertake a visitation of the Diocese of Worcester and had instructed the bishop to summon clergy and people to meet him in the cathedral church on a certain day in March. The bishop accordingly sent notices to the cathedral chapter, to the collegiate churches, and to the monasteries, and among the latter to Whitstones. What did the prioress do? She wrote to the archbishop to explain that on that day the convent chaplain would act as its representative, since it is not fitting that women should mix themselves up with men's meetings. The occasion, be it remembered, was one of great importance, possibly of danger, for religious communities in the diocese. The convent was close at hand, so that there was no question of travel or expense. But it was not fitting that women should mix themselves up with men's meetings, so she stood aside. That is perhaps hardly a fair example, for in the case of a man, there were special conditions to be taken into account. Yet, the chronicles, the records, the romances, and the poems of the Middle Ages give a general impression that most medieval women would have taken the same point of view as the prioress of Wheatstones. They performed their own duties adequately. They received a great deal of outward respect. They may have found life on the whole rather dull, and they did not meddle with what did not concern them. The first process of construction, that is to say, had produced a theory in marked contrast with that held by the world of today, and a practice in many cases consonant with that theory. Yet, if we care to look below the surface, we shall find the second process also at work. We shall find that not even all theorists thought alike, and that practice did not always fit the more usual theory. Position counted and brains counted, even in a woman, even in the Middle Ages. The heiress to a great fief, for example, was a person of importance and independence, and if she added personality to her other endowments, might act with considerable freedom. A few real individualities of this sort stand out against that rather impersonal background to which our imperfect knowledge of the Middle Ages at present condemns us. Such, for example, was Joan of Acre, second surviving daughter of Edward I. Joan lived for 35 years only, for she was born the year her father came to the English throne, and she died the year he left it. Yet, that short space was long enough to show her mettle and to differentiate her from more conventional women. At 25, she was left a widow by the death of the elderly Earl of Gloucester, to whom she had been married for political reasons. For similar reasons, Edward I was on the point of arranging a second marriage for her when she confronted him boldly with a statement that she intended this time to marry the man of her own choice, who happened to be a mere knight, Ralph of Monthermer. He stood right outside the narrow circle of great earls and barons, and Edward I could find no words strong enough in which to express his opinion of Ralph's ineligibility for such a match. But Jones, says the Opus Chronicorum, argued the point vigorously. It's not humiliating or disgraceful, she said, for some great and powerful earl to marry some poor and unimportant little woman. And so, contrariwise, for a countess it is neither blameworthy nor difficult to promote a strenuous youth. She followed up words by deeds, and after a first tremendous explosion of anger, Edward I accepted the situation and gave to the second husband that same title, Earl of Gloucester, which the first had held. A less well known example of Joan's courage and independence occurred in 1305 when her young brother Edward, Prince of Wales, fell under the displeasure of his father, who cut off all supplies. The prince's only idea of meeting this situation was to write lamentable letters to his friends and relatives and to trail miserably about the country as near as he dared to the court in the hope of some sudden relenting on the king's part. A good many people wrote sympathetic letters or invited the prince to visit them, but the only person who took practical measures was his sister Joan. She placed at his disposal all her goods and all her husband's, and she sent him her seal, by means of which he might be able to secure much that would not have been forthcoming at his own discredited order. She risked, that is to say, in eager partisanship, all that she had gradually recovered of her father's favour. Fortunately, the trouble blew over within a month or two. Turning from the world of the court and castle to the world of learning, there too we can find instances of women's activities. As early as the 11th century, more than one woman doctor was practicing, lecturing, and writing in the medical school at Salerno in Italy. 200 years afterwards, Pierre Dubois, a French lawyer, was foreshadowing the modern medical missionary by suggesting that women should be taught languages, surgery, medicine, and the rubrics and canons of the church as a preliminary to work in the East. It is only fair to add that Pierre Dubois was full of ideas which astounded his contemporaries. Moreover, his ends were more medieval than his means. He wanted to recover the Holy Land. His women doctors were to marry intelligent infidels or schismatics, cure their bodily diseases first, and then take advantage of their gratitude to wheedle them out of their theological errors. Coming to a very recent and controversial question, the ministry of women, there is matter for thought in a tale told by the St. Albans monk Roger of Wendover at the beginning of the 13th century. It is as follows. There lived somewhere in Burgundy a certain maiden who had all the advantages the world could give her: noble parents, riches, and the promise of a desirable marriage. But from early youth, says the chronicle, she had been instructed in liberal studies, and when the time of her wedding came unpleasantly near, she slipped away to take refuge, not in a nunnery, but in a convent of Franciscan friars. She cut off her hair, put on the serge habit and rope girdle, went barefoot, and tried, but says legend quite unsuccessfully, to do away with all her natural attractions. No austerity was too great for her, no prayer too lengthy, no task too hard. She preached the gospel of peace through cities and villages, more particularly to those of her own sex. The biography has no final chapter, for no one told Roger of Wendover the end of it. But as he truly said, what he had related already was quite sufficient. The way in which the St. Albans monk tells that story is itself instructive. He lifts his hands in admiration of his heroine's saintliness, but he does not raise his eyebrows in astonishment at the peculiarity of her career. Not a word in his account suggests that he regarded that feature of the story as curious, abnormal, or interesting. We should think his attitude an evidence of the indifference of the medieval mind to breaches of accepted etiquette, if it were not that we have an immense number of examples in other connections which prove the exact opposite. At any rate, whatever Roger of Wendover's views may have been, that lady, if indeed she ever existed, was certainly an exception to rules. She falls into line with the other instances, some of which I have given, many more of which could be found, of women whose opportunities and ambitions were far wider than was usual in the age in which they lived. Add to such practical examples the theorizing of Dubois and others, and you have an illustration of the second part of my metaphor. The seedlings are growing beside the parent plant, but they are so unlike it as to be hardly recognizable. For the time being, they remain almost unnoticed, but by and by, when the shadow of the stronger growth is removed, they will shoot up and call attention to themselves. Women doctors, women preachers, women at liberty to develop their own talents and tastes were rare phenomena in the Middle Ages. But they were there. Moreover, their presence might be of real historical importance. Let me quote you in illustration of that a passage from Dr. Rashdall's Universities of Europe in the Middle Ages. He has been describing the way in which precedents were sought in the medieval university system and illustrates his point as follows. The University of London, after being empowered by royal charter to do all things that could be done by any university, was legally advised that it could not grant degrees to women without a fresh charter because no university had ever granted such degrees. We have seen that there were women doctors at Salerno. In a footnote, he adds, I have been informed by an eminent judge who was one of the council on whose advice the university acted that a knowledge of this fact would have modified his opinion. The position of women, then, may serve on the whole as an illustration of my general contention that the Middle Ages, on the one hand, evolved a social order of their own, different from but linked to the social order familiar to us today, while on the other hand, they made suggestions and experiments to which the modern world would respond more readily than the medieval. That is a single illustration. There are others. There are many others. There are more than we know of or shall know of until we have carried our investigations of medieval conditions much farther than any point as yet reached. Before that can be done, there will have to be a general and sincere recognition of two facts at present very imperfectly realized. The first is that the study of the Middle Ages is not an antiquarian pursuit quite unconnected with present day interests and problems. It is the examination of a stage as essential as any other to the making of the world we live in. The second is that our knowledge of that stage at present lags behind our knowledge of others because there are not as yet nearly enough workers in the field of medieval history. Let me conclude by examining a little more in detail these two statements. To the first, witness is being borne by the whole series of lectures of which this is a part. Moreover, the fact perhaps needs less demonstration by argument than it would have done 6 years ago. We have been fighting a war on fields well known to Englishmen of the 14th and 15th centuries. In the course of it, we have tried some experiments which differed in degree rather than in kind from some they knew well. And we are now forced with a social reconstruction of a sort which suggests at every turn comparisons with the medieval world. Shall we ever again be as national or as insular as we were before 1914? Do we not hear talk on every hand of internationalism, and is not our class warfare organizing itself on lines that recall those horizontal strata of medieval society? The social chain of the medieval world did indeed bind in mutual dependence different classes in a single country. But in mutual affection and cooperation, it bound each class to the same class all over Western Europe. Again, take the question of travel and transport, so vital in its importance to a community. Are not our roads and our rivers being utilized to an extent unparalleled since the introduction of steam traction? The motor lorry, indeed, is an animal both swifter and uglier than the medieval pack horse, but he serves the same purposes. Of late years, we have tasted by personal experience some minor medieval discomforts. We have stumbled through unlighted and unmended streets. We have gone to bed betimes of necessity and not of choice. We have done without numbers of things which, under peaceful modern conditions, seem the normal accompaniments of everyday life. Finally, across the Irish Sea at this moment, scenes are being enacted which recall the Middle Ages at their worst. Men are standing by inactive while their fellows are murdered before their eyes, just as men stood and watched while the treasurer of England was done to death in London in 1327, or while many another victim, more obscure, perished multis astantibus et admirantibus. Medieval society then had many features for which we may be half prepared by what we ourselves have seen and heard. For thorough investigation, of course, we should have to add to the general interest the examination of huge masses of manuscript material, the technical training which is preliminary to such an examination, and the patience, concentration, and enthusiasm required for any serious occupation. It is the enthusiasm which is chiefly lacking. The material and the training are readily accessible. I speak to you in a college to which the University of London has assigned its only chair of medieval history. Close at hand is the Public Record Office with such a store of material for the history of medieval England as can hardly be described in language which will not seem exaggerated. Before next year is far advanced, we shall have in Bloomsbury the modest beginnings of what in time will be, I trust, one of the most important centers of historical studies in England. Among those studies, medieval subjects should play their proper part. They can only do so if there are forthcoming both workers prepared to labor in those fields and endowments to facilitate their labors. And when we have our workers and the tools are ready to their hands and their task is on the way to accomplishment, what shall we have secured? First, clearer knowledge of the past. Next, clearer vision for the future. The Middle Ages, we have said, had every vice and every virtue. And among the virtues, none was greater than the energy with which they concentrated upon realizing their ideals. Let them then leave us that legacy. Let us bring to the solution of our own problems the patience and the passion they brought to theirs. We can find our determination voiced for us once for all, not indeed by a man of the Middle Ages, but by a man who was heir of all the ages. Bring me my bow of burning gold, bring me my arrows of desire, bring me my spear, O clouds unfold, bring me my chariot of fire. I will not cease from mental fight, nor shall my sword sleep in my hand, till we have built Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant land. End of section 20. Section 21 of Medieval Contributions to Modern Civilization. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Medieval Contributions to Modern Civilization. Economics Part 1 by Adair. Economics. Footnote. Further information can be gathered from any standard textbook. Cunningham's Growth of English Industry and Commerce covers both medieval and modern periods. Lipson, Economic History of England, and Ashley, Economic History, both deal only with the medieval period. Lipson is an accurate and rather dull work. Ashley is possibly not so reliable, but far more brilliant and suggestive. Ashley's Economic Organization of England is a slight but vivid sketch of the whole period. G. O'Brien's Medieval Economic Teaching is useful for economic theory. For guild socialism, the works of G. D. H. Cole are valuable, especially his Chaos and Order in Industry and Self-Government in Industry. End footnote. In the Middle Ages, it was the fashion for every good chronicler to begin a history of his own time with an account of the creation of the world. Even in this chilly age of scientific research, there is still something to be said in favor of this principle, for by so doing, it is possible to explain the present by the past, to emphasize in the past those tendencies which we, looking back with the superior wisdom of a later century, know are going to mold the mind of the present, determine its political likes and dislikes, and fashion the main lines of its economic life. This may offend the sense of those historians who hold that history should be written with a mind swept clear of all knowledge of after events, but all the same, it produces valuable results. It brings into relief what is really permanent in the life of a people. It marks out the lines along which it has progressed in the past, and if approached in an optimistic spirit, it may hold out some hope of a tentative solution of the problems of the present and even of the future. At any rate, it is often willing to teach us what to avoid, though we, far too frequently, turn a deaf ear to its warnings. For the life of a people is continuous, and therefore its history must show a gradual progress from one stage of existence to the next, with few, if any, cataclysmic changes. Every institution we possess, every form of industrial or commercial activity can show a steady and unbroken development, so that it is strictly true to say that the Middle Ages must influence most profoundly the life of today, because the life of today is, in the broadest sense, the product of medieval conditions. But if the two extremes in the series were placed side by side, if the institution of today were compared with that very different germ in the Middle Ages from which it has sprung, no one could profess to discover the faintest resemblance between the two. What similarity is there between the medieval guild, with its profound and intense local feeling, its stringent regulation of its members' industrial activity, its fixing of prices, the religious feeling which permeated its every aspect, its charities, its liveries, its festivals, and the great capitalistic organizations of today of worldwide scope. A port sunlight, for example, with its factories, its fleet of ships, its tropic islands to feed it with the essential raw materials, its distributing agents in every part of the habitable globe, and yet there is a broad road of historical development that leads straight from the one to the other. For out of the corruption of the guild system, capitalism in industry developed. Commercial capital, which was probably one of the earliest forms to arise, was able to secure the subordination of allied crafts, and long before the Industrial Revolution came with its power machinery, capitalism was a vital factor in industry, and in certain trades, the factory had already become the industrial unit. The Industrial Revolution merely selected and emphasized those forms of economic organization which were most suited to its rapid development, and so laid the foundation of the industrial system as we know it today. On this foundation, steam and electric transport and the development of international finance have built that ostentatious and somewhat insecure edifice of large scale production which has divided the world into the antagonistic classes of employers and employed, and which at present is threatening immediate collapse and the engulfing with it of the whole system of our industrial organization. If a tree is to be judged by its fruits, this is not a disaster greatly to be deplored. Or, if we regard that most conservative of all industries, agriculture, what possible resemblance can be seen between the great farms of Canada or the United States, with their enormous fields tilled almost entirely by power machinery, from the ploughing of the land to the harvesting of the ripe grain, and the two or the three field system of the Middle Ages, with fairly large fields indeed, but each field split up into acre or half acre strips, with each man's land scattered throughout the common fields, a strip here and a strip there, with its primitive and rigid system of agriculture, its crude ox drawn plough, its cooperative cultivation, its sowing and reaping and threshing by hand, its dependence on the waste and the woodland, its manorial services, its normal condition of self sufficiency. And yet, once more, the Middle Ages live still in the most modern methods. To prove this, it is not necessary to stress mere verbal survivals. The fact that we still use the term furlong, the length of the medieval furrow and chain, the breadth of the medieval acre strip, for long before the Middle Ages were drawing to a close, they were growing up side by side with those scattered strips, the more convenient compact farms, consisting sometimes of land enclosed from the waste, sometimes of a bundle of neighboring strips gradually and painfully gathered into the same hand. To a few minds that rose above the common agricultural ruck, these compact farms, which had grown up almost as it were by accident, were not long in demonstrating their superiority, and they began to be consciously imitated. Books were written advocating their creation. A general feeling arose that land in severalty was necessary for progressive agriculture, especially as, at this time, the balance that had held in the Middle Ages between arable and pasture land was being completely reversed by the realization of the profits that came from intelligent sheep farming. Enclosing became the fashion, and when science began to lend its aid to the agriculturist, when root crops, fodder crops, and the more careful preparation of the soil began to be regarded, the agricultural revolution exercised the same selective power as did the industrial revolution some years later. To the compact farm, its methods could be most easily applied. Therefore, it was primarily to the compact farm that it brought prosperity. The strip system and the open fields had to give way, and contemporary industrial conditions soon turned their defeat into absolute rout. Therefore, the compact fields were the prevalent type, to which the application of the simpler forms of agricultural machinery brought still greater prosperity, and with the bringing under cultivation of the vast and level areas of the New World, the use of steam or electric power became common, and further mechanical improvements followed as of course. Thus, both in industrial and agricultural practice, modern conditions grew naturally out of medieval organization, and the latter must have contributed much to the form that modern life has taken. As much can be said of medieval economic theory. It seems indeed a far cry from the prohibition of usury, which is stressed so much and often so inaccurately in economic textbooks, to those philanthropic gentlemen of today who, under ostentatiously English names, are prepared to lend us any sum from £5 to 5,000 on our note of hand alone. And yet, there is really no break in the chain of development that connects the two, for the prohibition of usury was but the one side of the medieval picture, and if usury was forbidden, interest was allowed. If, on the one hand, it was held wrongful to exact payment or usury from your fellow man for a loan which he repaid punctually and in full, for any gain that had accrued to him by that loan was the result of his own intelligence or his own labor and not of yours, yet compensation or interest could always be claimed if you had suffered actual loss in consequence of making the loan, either because it was not repaid punctually or because you had been yourself placed in difficulties for lack of the money, or because you had thereby been hindered from making a just and legitimate profit. As the opportunities for the employment of money in trade and industry increased, the chances that the making of a loan would react unfavorably on the lender grew greater. Interest assumed an ever more prominent position at the expense of usury, which was gradually pushed into the background. The secular government, which had succeeded the church in the regulation of economic activities, considered that enough had been done when it had laid down maximum rates of interest, and finally, even that precautionary measure was abandoned, in England at any rate, with the repeal of the usury laws in 1839, thus allowing free scope to the activities of those who lend out at interest. But it is extraordinarily significant of the way in which a regulation which is based upon sound principles will persist, or, if for a time abolished, will later be revived, that by the Moneylenders Act of 1900, once more was there imposed a limitation on the rate of interest that could be charged, and once more was there a legal difference between that and usury, not certainly the same as existed in the Middle Ages, but based upon essentially the same idea, that of a reasonable justice between lender and borrower. Here you have had the same fundamental idea leading to much the same conclusion in both medieval and in modern times, but that was by no means always the case. If one desired to show that there was any real connection between that central doctrine of medieval theory, the idea of the just price, and the doctrine which was equally vital to the England of the late 19th century, that of the free competitive price, one would, on the face of things, have considerable difficulties to meet. Yet, if one were to read, quote, buying and selling seem to be established for the common advantage of both parties, one of whom requires that which belongs to the other and vice versa. End quote. One would be tempted to exclaim, ah, yes, from Adam Smith, no doubt, and from this he will prove that, as both parties benefit from the transaction, there is no sense in trying to impose restrictions upon it. Every man will then be at liberty to seek his own profit, and the sum of the profits of each will be the profit of all, that is, of the country at large, hence the value of free trade and competitive prices. But it is nothing of the kind. The quotation really comes from St. Thomas Aquinas, the greatest exponent of economic theory in the Middle Ages, and he goes on from it to prove the value of the just price, not of the competitive price. Therefore, different though these two things be, they obviously have something in common. Adam Smith and those predecessors of his who were preaching these doctrines through the whole of the 18th century were merely harking back to one of the fundamental truths that underlay the idea of the just price and of the legislation that strove to enforce it, not only in the Middle Ages but also under the Tudors and earlier Stuarts. Adam Smith approached the problem from the soulless standpoint of the economist, St. Thomas from the more human one of the moralist and the theologian. But their problem was much the same in the two cases. The medley of conflicting interests under which trade groaned, and the lack of some sound principle upon which economic theory could base any doctrine as to the trade relations of man with man. And so one might go through the whole gamut of the economic theory and practice of modern times, but within the limits of a brief article, it would be impossible to trace this steady and at times almost imperceptible development which has changed the medieval organization into the fundamentally different one of the 20th century. Rather, is it desirable to turn our attention to the limited and more precise sense in which it could be said that the Middle Ages have contributed to our present civilization? Of these contributions, there seem to be two. A direct influence by the survival down to modern times of some typical medieval practice or idea, and a more indirect influence arising from the conscious imitation by men of the present day of some medieval institution which they have learned to respect. The survivals are actually few in number and are often more interesting than important, but some at least still form an essential portion of our civilization. In the realms of industry, we sometimes confide ourselves to the provincial make to measure tailor or bootmaker, who is often a handicraftsman employing his own capital to supply his small stock in trade of cloth or of leather, possibly with men working under him, but nonetheless supervising and often working with them himself. Then there is the small dressmaker in the back street who makes up her customers' goods and so requires no capital but her needle or her sewing machine. She represents another phase of medieval industry which we still have with us and which plays a not unimportant part in our appearance as a nation. Tailor, bootmaker, and dressmaker alike have survived the competition of capitalism and large scale production, although there are signs even now that their doom is not far distant, and they still remain as medieval in their business organization as they are, but too often in their methods and their ideas of current fashions. Or consider the west of Ireland and the west of Scotland tweeds. They are still made to some considerable extent in the people's own houses. The industry is still domestic, very comparable to that which was growing up in the wool trade throughout the period of the later Middle Ages and which reached its full importance with the decadence of the guild system in the 15th century. The centuries have passed them by, and today they have an importance as having done something by the force of example to assist in the revival of village industries, to which I shall presently refer. All the examples of survivals that have hitherto been given have been taken from the realm of industry, but commerce can provide an even more important one. The great fairs that are still held on the continent serve precisely the same purpose as they did in the Middle Ages. Thither merchants still bring their wares and set them out before the buyers, who flock from all corners of the country, sure of finding the class of goods for which the fair has become famous. Such are the great book and leather fairs of Leipzig, the fairs of Nizhny Novgorod, where the furs of the north, the tea and silk of China, are purchased by the merchants of western Russia, and in a lesser degree, the more famous of the markets in some of the great capitals, the Billingsgate and Covent Garden of London, or Les Halles of Paris, which bear to the town somewhat the same relation as a street in the great medieval fair bore to the whole country. And even high finance has its medieval survivals, some still in a very flourishing condition. Possibly lending to kings is not practiced so much today when crowns are falling too fast to be pleasant. But the Bardi and Peruzzi of the 14th century have worthy successors in the Rothschilds of the 19th. But it is in less exalted spheres that the survival is most striking. The pawnbroker is a useful member of society who is still with us. In the early days, he was usually, though not always, a Jew, and occasionally he received rather quaint pledges. One can conceive that he would have little objection to taking charge of the plate of Lincoln Minster, which Bishop Chesney pledged with Aaron of Lincoln in the middle of the 12th century. But when William of Walterville, abbot of Peterborough, in 1175 broke open the reliquaries in his own church and pledged the relics of the saints together with the arm of Saint Oswald, king and martyr, with the Jews, the least that might have been expected was a miracle in which the arm of the wrathful Oswald should have played the principal part. Alas, the chronicler is silent as to any such sequel. But that the path of the pawnbroker in those early days was often a thorny one, we learn from the following tale, culled from the middle of the 12th century. Quote, a mighty noble and robber pledged his carriage for 20 deniers with Reuben. Now, Simeon desired to go on a journey and asked Reuben for the loan of the carriage. Reuben said, you must first ask permission of the Lord. But the Lord being out, Simeon asked his lady, who gave him leave. It happened that on their journey, Simeon and his wife passed the Lord's castle in the carriage, whereupon the lady, seeing this, declared she would never sit in the carriage where a Jewess had sat. She sent for Reuben and demanded the carriage back to atone for the profanation, and declared that she would make one of her servants swear that it had suffered more than 20 dinars damage. When Reuben pointed out that she had given Simeon permission, she denied it. End quote. Now, the problem arises, who ought to stand the loss of the 20 dinars, Reuben or Simeon? But unfortunately, our curiosity must go unsatisfied, for the question is left unanswered. But Christians did not long leave the Jews unrivaled in so lucrative a field as pawnbroking. And just before the end of the Middle Ages, we actually hear of a religious order, the Franciscans, entering the ancient and honorable money-lending profession, though be it said, from the worthiest of motives. In 1462, they founded the first of their Montes Pietatis at Orvieto in order to loan money to the poor at reasonable rates. So popular did they become that 11 more were founded in Italy during the next 30 years, and today the Mont-de-Piété, or State Pawnbroking Establishment of Paris, preserves the name and to some extent the laudable objects of the houses set up by the excellent Franciscans. But after all, interesting as these survivals are, important as may be the part they play in the daily life of some of us, their influence upon modern economic conditions seems almost negligible in comparison with that which has resulted from the study of the Middle Ages and the conviction that followed in the minds of many eminent men of the later 19th century. A conviction that is still a very living thing, that the Middle Ages had much to teach us, much that would lift us out of the sordid materialism into which we had sunk, much that might aid in solving those social and industrial problems that were crowding thick and fast upon England at the end of the last century. The first 50 years of the 19th century found England profoundly steeped in an indolent and insular spirit of self-satisfaction, an England given up to the grosser forms of money-making, lacking in aesthetic appreciation or in any honest sympathy with the world that surrounded her, an England like nothing so much as that fine flower of her artistic effort, her horsehair covered furniture, smooth and sleek and shiny and exceeding loathsome to the touch. We were indeed a nation of shopkeepers, and shopkeepers of the sanctimonious type that praised God daily that they were not as other men. The corrupting finger of trade had touched everything. It was the Englishman's boast that he turned out good, solid stuff. With its beauty, its originality, even the measure with which it met the convenience of his customers in other lands, he was not concerned. What was good enough for him must indeed be good enough for the rest of the world. Even if the name originated in the early 18th century, the conventional picture of John Bull might well have been first drawn during these years. So much does it reek of their typical beef fed self complacency. With those whom he was pleased to call the lower classes, he did not have much concern. They had certainly given trouble earlier in the century, but by 1850 they seemed to have been successfully hypnotized by their mechanics institutes and their politico socialist discussions, and it was once more safe to treat them as so many cogs in the industrial wheel, for why should they not be fully satisfied so long as regular wages rewarded the years of their toil and a strictly just workhouse system tended their grey hairs to the grave? Against all this, a small group of idealists revolted. Ruskin and William Morris were led by their desire to introduce more beauty into a drab and material world, to strike at the root of the evil and find some means to breathe fresh life into industry, to make each worker feel that he was producing something worthwhile. It was impossible to do this, they soon came to the conclusion, so long as the workman was regarded as so much labor material, so long as machine production was allowed to crush out all individuality. This quarrel with the current methods of industry drove them and those who thought like them to seek inspiration from the past. Just as the pre Raphaelites sought to recover the art of the later Middle Ages, Ruskin and Morris, enthralled by an idealized picture of medieval industry in the heyday of the guild system, strove to re establish such conditions as the thought might secure that economic independence and that freedom to follow the lure of his own spirit, which they imagined the medieval craftsmen to possess. And therefore arose that movement for the establishment of arts and crafts, for the revival of village industries. As Walter Crane well says in his article, The Revival of Handicrafts and Design. Excerpt. The movement indeed represents, in some sense, a revolt against the hard mechanical life and its insensibility to beauty. Quite another thing to ornament. It is a protest against that so called industrial progress which produces shoddy wares, the cheapness of which is paid for by the lives of their producers and degradation of their users. It is a protest against the turning of men into machines, against artificial distinctions in art, and against making the immediate or market value or possibility of profit the chief test of artistic merit. It asserts, moreover, apart from the very wholesome and real pleasure in the fashioning of a thing with claims to art and beauty, the struggle with and triumph over technical necessities which refuse to be gainsaid. End excerpt. Along with the arts and crafts movement went the revival of village industries. It was just as medieval in its inspiration, for it sought, on the one hand, to recreate the master craftsman working for himself with his own materials, and largely guided by traditional or conventional models, but in no way precluded from making his own variations from them, and on the other, to snatch industry from the grime and drudgery of large towns, from the slavery of machinery and the routine of the factory, and by transplanting it into the country to breed another type of worker who fashioned things with his brain as well as with his hands, who was his own master and sound in body as in mind. A man who could say with touchstone, even more truly than Shakespeare had foreseen, quote, "An ill favoured thing, sir, but mine own," end quote. For he would be speaking not merely of possession, which after all is little enough, but of that godlike power of creation, of loving the work of your hands that you have moulded from shapeless clay to a thing of beauty or of use. This is medievalism right enough, but medievalism seen through a golden haze, with all its pretty failings wiped out, its local jealousies and small discomforts ignored. Medievalism with the emphasis laid on every feature that contrasted most strongly with modern industrial methods, and because of that very contrast, rather than by reason of inherent value, its every feature pronounced worthy to redeem the world from the parlous condition into which it had drifted for lack of a due observance of the fundamentals of medieval life. But by teaching these fundamentals, much that was best in the Middle Ages was brought to bear on modern civilization and influenced it profoundly. For though William Morris did not really know the true Middle Ages at all, and did not see them with the eyes of the people who lived in them, yet, in a way, he knew them better than we do, with all our knowledge of their infinite variety, drawn from painful research into the records they have left behind them. For an idealist and a visionary himself, he could speak across the centuries with men of like substance. We are too prone to stress the exceptions. We know too many details always to estimate fairly the broad light and shade of the picture. We are a little too ready to describe the Middle Ages from its lists of crimes and misdemeanors to delineate society, as it were, from a Newgate calendar. Religion was then a living force, and its precepts guided a man in every walk of life, whether sleeping or working, eating or fasting. If one wants to know the economic theories of the day, it is to the moralists, the theologians, the scholastic writers that one goes, and merely to say that their theories were often violated proves little. That there are thieves in London does not prove that no man's goods are safe. Indeed, every breach of a law that is recognized as such but serves to emphasize the reality of such a law, and many of the broad fundamental truths upon which the Middle Ages based much of its life have, of recent years, gained acceptance once more by moralists and economists alike. Sometimes there has been conscious imitation, sometimes merely a revival of past ideas unconsciously evoked by similar circumstances and emotions. When Morris and his followers preached the dignity of labor, they were intentionally treading the path already traced by many medieval footsteps. What the Benedictines taught by their example, Trithemius at the very end of the 15th century expressed in words, quote, "Man is born to labor as the bird to fly, and hence it is contrary to the nature of man when he thinks to live without work." End quote. End of section 21. Section 22 of Medieval Contributions to Modern Civilization. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Medieval Contributions to Modern Civilization. Economics Part 2 by E.R. Adair. Mere similarity between medieval precept and modern practice does not, however, always imply any continuity or even any attempt by men of the present day to imitate what seemed good to the 14th or 15th century, and it is necessary, even though it be difficult, to remember that there is no direct connection between the profiteering act or the food control of today and the doctrine preached by that same Trithemius when he writes, quote, "Whoever buys corn, meat, and wine in order to drive up their price and to amass money at the cost of others is, according to the law of the church, no better than a common criminal. In a well governed community, all arbitrary raising of prices, in the case of articles of food and clothing, is peremptorily stopped. In times of scarcity, merchants who have supplies of such commodities can be compelled to sell them at fair prices, for in every community, care should be taken that all the members be provided for, and not only a small number be allowed to grow rich and revel in luxury to the hurt and prejudice of the many." End quote. These ideas are not precisely those that would have commended themselves to the economist of 100 years ago. How then is it that they find favor today? It is merely that the just price is coming to its own again, based indeed on very similar factors to those that determined it in the Middle Ages: wages, cost of material, and a reasonable profit to the producer. This is no doubt partly due to the artificial conditions created by the war, but yet, at bottom, even this is the indirect result of the medieval influence which was brought to bear on English economic theory by the school of William Morris. One of the changes which he did a great deal to stimulate, although he cannot be said to be its sole author, was the reassociation of ethics with economics. In the Middle Ages, there had been the closest union between the two. In fact, it would not be too strong a statement to say that all the fundamental principles of economic theory were part of the ethics of the day. And this lasted For some considerable time after the Middle Ages had passed away, much of the government regulation of the Tudors and even of the early Stuarts being set up on a definitely ethical basis. But as religion became more individualistic with the advent of the reformers, as the master and apprentice became more definitely employer and employed, and the employer no longer shared in the actual craftsmanship and so was less capable of understanding the needs of his workmen, commercial and industrial practice began to overcome the authority of general theory, and new theories that were evolved owed their existence to an attempt to explain and justify existing facts rather than to establish any general basis for economic activity. This became much more pronounced during the 18th century and culminated in the great school of English theorists who looked to Adam Smith as their progenitor. Then came that chilly abstraction, the economic man, divorced not only from all ethical considerations but even from human and psychological ones as well. Against all this, the teaching of William Morris inaugurated a revolt which joined hands with the better aspects of the humanitarian movement and began that stressing of other than purely economic considerations in the world of industry and commerce, which has culminated in the attitude of the present day, in the pressure for an improved standard of life and a minimum wage, in the treatment of employees as human beings with tastes to be studied and bodies and minds to be cared for, as men and women and not as mere cogs in the industrial machine. It looks a far cry from the Middle Ages to these essentially modern doctrines, and the road that connects the two is often obscure, but it does exist. And had medieval economic theory made no other contribution than this to the solution of the problems that face our civilization of today, it would amply have justified itself. But, in fact, much more can be said in its praise. To us who live in the midst of industrial turmoil, of strikes for higher wages, of strikes for shorter hours, strikes for nationalization, and strikes for local self government in the factory, the world seems caught in an infernal labyrinth from which there is no escape. But all the same, we do struggle to escape, and to some of us, groping wildly after light, the thought comes that the experience of the past might provide suggestion and precept. It was but natural that those who had already been deeply influenced by the ideas of William Morris, ideas which had achieved a certain amount of success in spite of the rather patronizing attitude that was taken by many of their exponents toward the unenlightened masses, should turn to that same epoch which had already been the source of his finest inspiration. And this was all the more natural because the most evil of the conditions they sought to destroy was capitalism, and it was one of their fondest beliefs that the characteristic institutions of the Middle Ages were the sworn enemies of the capitalist. Moreover, the leaders of this new movement were not, as a rule, men who had been at all influenced by the scientific study of medieval times that had been made since the days of William Morris, a study which has shown that many of his historical conceptions would not stand detailed examination. I need hardly tell you that it was in the guild that this small group of writers saw salvation. Morris had justly realized that the guild was the central feature of industrial life in the Middle Ages, that the craftsman as a unit was as nothing, that he attained to the full measure of his existence only as a member of his guild, that in his guild he enjoyed some of the advantages of corporate life, that he learned some of the lessons of self regulation, if not of self government, that there he enjoyed the support of his fellows without sacrificing his industrial independence. It was the guild that strove for good quality and fair prices, honest work, and a decent living for all. What Morris failed to realize was that, while in theory the guild was all this and more, in practice it fell far below such a standard. Its members were but human after all, and as full of human failings as their less favored brethren of the 20th century. They scamped their work on occasion, they evaded the guild regulations when they could, they put their best cloths on the outside of a bale and the poorest in the middle, they moistened groceries to make them heavier, they soldered together broken swords and sold them to confiding customers for as good as new. Indeed, they would have found themselves thoroughly at home in the present age. And even the guild itself loses some of its glamour when viewed at close quarters. Its regulations often proved oppressive and unfairly restrictive, and as the Middle Ages wore to a close, it often steadily tended to become an exclusive body of masters, careless of the interests of the craft as a whole, thoughtful only for the gain of that particular section from which its members were drawn. But the protagonists in the movement for the revival of the guilds, the industrious Mr. Penty and in a lesser degree Mr. Orridge, were not hampered by too close an acquaintance with the economic history of the Middle Ages. Even in his latest work, A Guildsman's Interpretation of History, Mr. Penty remains the same guileless enthusiast that he was in the beginning. He can still believe in the pure and undiluted communalism of early society, in its degradation by a foul conspiracy of lawyers, capitalists, and religious reformers, and he can still write of it in a way reminiscent of nothing so much as Fenimore Cooper in praise of the noble redskin. Quote, "Looking at feudalism from this point of view," he says, "it may be said that, while its existence was due to the depredations of robber knights, and though these knights would have certain groups of workers at their mercy, there would be other knights or lords who came into being as protectors of the communal rights of the people. Such were the chivalrous knights of romance and legend. The serfs of the robber knights would be tyrannized over because the robber knights would never feel their position to be secure. But the serfs of the chivalrous knights would enjoy all the advantages of a communal life, for the chivalrous knights, owing their position to popular election, would have no desire to tyrannize." End quote. Now, a man who can write such unmitigated nonsense as this would seem little likely to found a movement that would prove of any real importance. And yet, While these early advocates of the adaptation of guilds to the needs of modern industry, Penty, Orridge, and Hobson, possessed none of the genius and little of the literary ability of a Ruskin or a Morris. They were dowered with that enthusiastic belief in themselves and their cause, which is eminently necessary if a new doctrine is to gather converts to its side. And converts they made, most notable among them being G.D.H. Cole, the present leader of the Guild Socialist School. With the appearance of Mr. Cole, a very material change comes over the whole affair. He was a man of considerable historical reading who was not likely to commit himself too openly to the rather wild statements of his predecessors. Therefore, much of the medieval idealism was dropped. It was felt that the truth about the medieval guild was, after all, a minor problem. If attention was to be concentrated on improvement in modern conditions, and though the Middle Ages were still recognized as the original source of inspiration, it was laid down quite clearly that the emphasis was to be on adaptation and not on mere imitation, that though the medieval guild would not meet the needs of modern industry, it might provide suggestions for what is really to be a new organism, specially devised to administer the industrial world after the elimination of private capitalist ownership. All the workers concerned in a particular type of industry, in coal mining, in railway transport, or in cotton manufacture, for example, are to be gathered into a national guild, which is to include those who work with their brains as well as those who work with their hands. And these guilds are gradually to be evolved out of the existing trade unions so soon as they can be persuaded to reorganize themselves on industrial instead of on craft lines. The factories or the mines or the railways are to be owned by the state, that is, by the community at large, but to be administered and controlled each by its respective guild. While the whole organization of the guild, from shop foreman up to central committee, is to be based on democratic election, though it is recognized that experts in various departments must be appointed on sound business principles and not as the result of the votes of their fellow workers. Side by side with this industrial organization of producers, there are to be national and local organizations of consumers and producers alike, as there are today, a central parliament, municipal authorities, county councils, and so on, and prices are to be regulated by the guilds in conjunction with these local or national governmental bodies. At the basis of the whole edifice, as the prime motive for any industrial action, Cole sees the principle of free social service, of work not for private profit but for the community at large. This guild socialism tacitly recognizes that trade unions, as they exist at present, are dying institutions, that they are essentially bound up with the wages system, and that having achieved what they set out to do, they are liable to embark on all sorts of new ventures and extravagant claims in order to retain the active adherence of their members. To this guild socialism says by implication and only very deferentially, for of the support of the trade unions, it has great hopes. Quote, if you will reconstruct the world, you must first reconstruct yourselves. Provide yourselves with a new organization and, what is far more difficult, provide your members with a new and more efficient stimulus to labor. End quote. Merits this new idea of guild socialism has in plenty. But this is not the place to discuss them. It will be sufficient to point out the vast difference that exists between these guilds and the medieval ones. The mere accident that these guilds are national and the earlier ones local is, after all, not the most vital distinction. That lies in the equality of every member of the guild and the democratic government of the industry as a whole, for it is very doubtful if there ever was for any length of time in medieval craft guilds either equality or democracy as we understand those terms. But though this sketch of the proposed guilds shows many other obvious differences in matters of organization from the medieval guilds, yet one must not be blinded to the share of the Middle Ages in this guild socialism movement, for it arose out of a study of medieval economic and social history, and it still retains a considerable number of essential qualities which were fondly believed by its originators to be derived from the craft guilds of the 14th century. By the arguments that I have developed and the examples that I have quoted during the course of this paper, I have tried to show the really vital bearing that medieval economic history has upon the most intimate and important aspects of our modern life. How medieval industrial and commercial methods are surviving even down to the present day. How a study of these dead institutions and discredited theories has led men to find good in them, to see remedies for some of our most pressing economic problems. How almost every institution that we have, industrial or commercial, financial or agricultural, owes something to the Middle Ages, how its present shape has been determined not only by the hands of time but also by the nature of the original clay from which it was molded. But such an argument as this, while possibly curious in itself, would be arid indeed, were not the just moral drawn from it. It was that moral with which we started, and to it we return, and we return the more readily because just at present it is of vital importance to bear it in mind. Our universities are turning out scores of people, mostly earnest young women, who have gained a smattering of historical knowledge and are possessed with the determination to do their duty by the world, whether the world likes it or not. And the spirit of the age leads their minds to the study of economic and social problems. But all they will consent to listen to are the most modern thinkers on the most modern topics, and the more diffuse the thinker, the better they like him. If we suggest to them that some foundation may be necessary, some real knowledge of the past desirable, they scornfully remind us that basements have gone out of fashion, that we live in a rapid age when the odious spadework necessary to foundations is no longer esteemed. Let the dead bury their dead. They want to produce something modern and to produce it now. And so it is to them that I would give my moral, though I doubt if they ever listen nowadays to such mid Victorian things. Let them ever remember that the past must be studied if the present will be understood, for it is out of the past that the present has been made. E.R. Adair. End of section 22.
Section 23 of Medieval Contributions to Modern Civilization. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Claire. Medieval Contributions to Modern Civilization. Politics by J.W. Allen. I have been asked to speak of the political conceptions of the Middle Ages under a heading which implies that those conceptions are, or have been, contributions to our modern civilization. I do not know in what sense that is so. Everything that we are and have has developed from the Europe of the medieval period, with some additional assistance direct from the world of Greece and of Rome. But that fact hardly helps me. The Middle Ages do indeed contribute directly to our civilization a wonderful legacy of artistic achievement, of which we, in the last few centuries, have largely proved ourselves unworthy. But when I come to political thought, I am at a loss what to say in this connection. All I can do is to ask the question, what value have or may have the political ideas of the Middle Ages for us here and now? I can ask this question, but I cannot answer it. There is an initial difficulty. I might ignore it, but I do not feel disposed to do so. I do not know what is meant by medieval political thought. If what is meant is all that was thought about politics as such in the Middle Ages, I don't know where to begin. The more I study the writings of those times, the more I become convinced that most of the questions that have been asked since the 15th century were asked then, and that most of the political ideas developed in modern times are to be found there. In fact, speaking generally, such study of the history of political thought as I have been able to make is gradually producing in me a conviction that ever since men began to think in general terms, they have been asking much the same questions and giving much the same answers. The differences between the questions and answers of one age and those of another are very frequently differences of form rather than of content. And specifically with regard to the Middle Ages, I get an impression that the more one looks, the more one finds. I have for a long time been telling my pupils that the theory of climate expounded by Jean Bodin in the 16th century was practically a new thing, that there is nothing similar to be found earlier except in some mere suggestions in Aristotle and Plato. My excuse is that the books say so, but it is not true. A theory of climate in Bodin's sense is explicit. I do not say fully developed, but quite explicit in the writings of Pierre Dubois very early in the 14th century. How much further it may go back, I do not know. Many people, I am sure, are under a quite wrong impression about it. People talk sometimes as though all through the Middle Ages men kept saying the same things or nearly the same things. The fact is, I think, far otherwise. Even if we take the term Middle Ages in its narrowest sense as covering the period from the 11th to the 15th century, we shall find change everywhere going on, and everywhere irreconcilable differences. There is a great change from the views of Hildebrand and his followers of the 12th century to the views of Aquinas in the 13th, and between Aquinas and William of Ockham perhaps a still greater change. This is a change that takes place in the thought of a series of men who all have the same kind of ecclesiastical bias and training, and who are asking the same questions as to the nature of secular authority and its relation to the Church. If we go outside this circle, we come at once to the sharpest antagonisms. Between the views of Aquinas and of Pierre Dubois, a great gulf is fixed. In truth, I think the Middle Ages, in this as in other things, are a period of harsh and violent contrasts, of contradictions, more hopeless perhaps than exist among modern thinkers. There are, of course, modern ideas you cannot possibly find in the Middle Ages, but theories of the sovereignty of the people are there, and Marsillo, and not Marsillo only, uses language at times that oddly suggests Rousseau. The conception of society and of government as a cooperative effort to realize merely temporal and material ends is in Dubois, and Dubois represents, I am sure, the views of many other people besides the ministers of Philip IV. And if you want to find in the Middle Ages the very latest thing in Bolshevist communism, you have only to look at the record of John Ball, the mad priest of Kent, who preached on Blackheath in 1381, or at what is called the Confession of Jack Straw. We are too much inclined to take the writings of ecclesiastics, of schoolmen, of the professed philosophers, as expressing the whole thought of the Middle Ages. Professed philosophers never do represent rightly the current thought of their time. The point of view of these writers is at once too detached and too ecclesiastical. The difficulty is that the mass of lay opinion on these subjects in the Middle Ages rarely found expression. There was, it is true, a school of juristic philosophy, but we get only fragmentary glimpses of the views of the governing statesmen of the 12th and 13th centuries, of the men in England who worked under Henry II, of the men who surrounded Henry III, and of whom Grotesque wrote that they it was who were hostile to the Church and determined the impious and secularizing policy of the government. Yet these men had views, however unformulated or confused, but only their deeds speak for them. When, as in the writings of Pierre Dubois, you get as it were a sudden revelation of the ways of thinking of such men, and this, I believe, is the case, you get a shock and exclaim, "How unmedieval, and even how modern!" Modern, if you like, but not unmedieval. Just so when Machiavelli formulates, though very imperfectly, the assumptions and the perceptions that had governed political action in Italy more and more for the last 200 years, we declare that he is the first of the moderns. I will add this, that the further you go into the thought of the 16th century, the more medieval you will find it. In England, in the last years of the century, Hooker is reproducing the views of Aquinas almost as fully as Suarez the Jesuit in the early 17th century. So far as there comes a real breakaway from all medieval conceptions, it occurs, I think, in the 17th century with Hobbes and Bacon. If we wish to understand the thought of any political or any other sort of thinker, it is first of all necessary to make clear to ourselves what question or questions he is trying to answer. I have painful memories of candidates for honors who appear to think that the difference between Aristotle and Plato is that Aristotle was thinking about things and Plato about nothing. Such candidates are confounding the actual with the real, and have not reached the starting point of philosophy. And people make the same mistake about the medieval thinkers. Plainly, they are not, most of them, writing about any existing state or about any state that ever had existed. After all, how could they? In the political welter of the earlier Middle Ages, they could not discern any distinct outline of any state at all, unless it were Christendom itself, and that visibly was not actually a state. Gradually, indeed, outlines emerged and became more or less distinct, and when a writer in the 14th century uses the word emperor, he frequently uses it, as does Marsilio, to mean simply the secular authority anywhere as contrasted with the church. But the earlier medieval schoolman is forced to disregard the actual by the nature of the actual in his time. What he is concerned with are the fundamental questions that do not change with circumstance. It is a mistake, I think, to regard medieval scholasticism in politics as Aristotelian. The schoolmen of the 13th century felt great reverence for Aristotle. He studied Aristotle as minutely as he could and quoted and referred to him constantly. But I do not think he ever understood Aristotle. He treated the Greek philosopher's writings as a collection of text which could be detached from their context and separately made use of, just as many people have treated the Bible. In this way, he at once avoided all danger of assimilating or even understanding Aristotle's thought, and was enabled to adopt his maxims and fit them into his own system. Nor did he hesitate, when he came upon a particularly tough and indigestible extract, to assert that here the philosopher was wrong. The schoolmen seem to me to have got little from Aristotle for all their talk of him. They Platonized him and they Christianized him, but they never understood him. Aquinas in some aspects is a Stoic, in some a Neoplatonist, never an Aristotelian. In the main, so far as there exists real difference between the political thought of one age and another, this difference is a consequence of the fact that in one age a particular question is asked more frequently and insistently than in another. The difference is a difference of subject, Most questions are asked, perhaps, in most ages, but in one age the stress is on one, in another on another. The difference between the thought of two periods becomes profound only when questions are asked in one that could not have been put in the other. Now, at last, I am coming to the essential subject of what so far may have seemed a rambling discourse. I may put it thus. What questions were asked in the Middle Ages that we should do well to ask now more often than we do? And what answers given to such questions by medieval thinkers have or may have a real value for us? It is not the thought of men like Dubois or Marsilio that has positive value for us now. It is, if anything, the thought, above all, of the schoolmen of the 13th century, detached, abstracted, forced into asking fundamental questions as to the basis of the state in a chaotic world. It is just these fundamental questions that need to be asked now and always. They are as unanswered now as they were then. The main questions of that scholastic thought of the 13th century seem to have been these. What is the nature of obligation as between man and, in connection with and dependence on that, what is the nature of political obligation? What is the purpose which justifies to reason all that we mean by government? Or, in other words, what is the true function of government? And finally, what is the character of that state, the realization of which will satisfy man's needs and aspirations? This last is the question Plato had asked in the Republic. These questions, though not exactly in the form I have given them, are raised at every point in the writings of the 12th and 13th centuries. The question of the extent of civil authority and law-making power was wholly bound up with the question as to moral obligation in general. The controversy as to the relations between Pope and Emperor, stripped of its non-essentials, was a controversy as to the end and purpose of life on earth. The answer given by the schoolmen to these questions was a complete and coherent whole. It began with the assertion of the real existence of what was called natural law. The term was a very old one. It had come down from the Latin Stoics, and to the fathers of the Church in the 4th and 5th centuries it connoted much it did in the Middle Ages. The Fathers repeat continually that natural law is in the heart of all men, written in the hearts of the Gentiles, in the phrase of St. Paul. To the Fathers, though not to the true Stoics, natural law is wholly a moral law, a law of conduct. It is a God-given intuition of the absolute good. The idea in the Fathers is a little vague and unrelated. In the 13th century it is much fuller. There are, says Aquinas, 3 modes in which God reveals himself. One direct and verbal, in the Scriptures, given once for all. The other 2 continuous and unceasing, one in visible non-human nature, the other in the heart and conscience of man. The lex aeterna, the plan of the world in the mind of God, he likens to the design of an unbuilt building in the mind of the architect. It is that to which all things move incessantly, and it is that by which they move. It can be known in its entirety to no man. But there is in every man a conscious participation in the eternal law, a partial consciousness of it, a sense of what he ought and ought not to do. This intuition as to right and wrong, this intuition of the absolute, is formulated by reason as the law of nature. So far as man adheres to that law, so far his will becomes one with the will of God in the everlasting act of creation. The term natural law, then, implies and involves a philosophy of the absolute good, an assertion that right and wrong exist in the nature of things unalterably. If there be any conception eminently characteristic of medieval political thought, it is this. It is true that already in the 14th century the idea is losing its grip on men's minds. It is fading. Natural law means little to Marsilio. It means nothing at all to Dubois. To Occam, well, I am not sure what it meant to that very difficult and uncompromising intellectualist. But on his own metaphysical premises, if I understand them aright, it should have meant nothing at all. But in the 12th and 13th centuries this conception of natural law dominates political thought. In relation to the state, men find in it at once a basis for law, a limitation on authority, and a purpose for government. Logically, it must have been so, for if the state does not create right, right must create the state. All human law, says Aquinas, I am translating from the Summa, precisely to the extent to which it partakes of right reason, is derived from the eternal law, that is, of course, by way of the law of nature. And again, every law framed by man has the character of true law. that is, creates obligation, exactly to that extent to which it is derived from the law of nature. He will not admit that obligation to obedience can be derived otherwise. Law must be derived from the general moral consciousness, and enactment inconsistent with that has no binding force. The most he will admit is that, for avoidance of scandal or disorder, it may be right to obey unjust law. It follows that there can be no law binding on the conscience save that which is directed to the common welfare. Law must be enacted, says Aquinas, for the common welfare of men, and failing this it has no binding power. If a ruler, he goes on to say, makes, or rather tries to make, law for the gratification of his own cupidity or vainglory, his enactments must be regarded as acts of violence rather than as laws. But he insists that if law be ordained for the common welfare and be consistent with the moral consciousness, it creates obligation and is binding absolutely. And this because every man is bound by the natural law to will and to work for the common welfare. I translate his words once more, words this time that recall the Conrad Social of Rousseau. For as any one man is part of multitude, all that every man has or is belongs to the multitude. But Aquinas goes further. So clearly does he see law as the expression of a common moral consciousness that he asserts that law may be made and obligation created by repeatedly multiplied acts which make a custom, since the reason and will of man is manifested in deed no less than in word. And similarly, law made by enactment may be abrogated by repeatedly multiplied acts in a contrary sense. There can, in fact, exist no binding law which is not an expression of man's sense of right. But it was not enough to conceive of law and of government as expressions of the moral consciousness and based on the law of nature. Law and government must, to justify themselves in the court of reason, be referred to a common end. And so the 13th century thinkers elaborate the conception of an ultimate and absolute end and purpose of life for all humanity. To this end, all politics, all law and government must necessarily be referred. For if there be such an end and purpose of life for all men, it follows that all government must have this end in view constantly and universally. This proposition is, by itself, undeniable, but the specific medieval assertion in regard to the question is twofold. Firstly, it is asserted, or assumed, as too obvious for assertion, that failure to recognize such a meaning and purpose in life leaves all government purposeless and means for society friction, waste, and chaos. And secondly, it is asserted that the end and purpose of life cannot rationally be conceived as lying within the sharp edges of this material world. It must be conceived as transcending this world. Nothing, in fact, short of real and vital union with God will suffice to satisfy man and realize his potentialities. In any case, the purpose of man's life cannot rationally be conceived in relation to any merely circumstantial and accidental needs or desires, or in relation to anything merely external and temporary, but only sub specie aeternus. It is, of course, the Church, at least in the view of the ecclesiastics and scholastics of the 12th and 13th centuries, that is the final authority as to the proper good of man. It is argued, therefore, that it is for the Church to judge of and to direct all state action. The distinction between temporal and spiritual disappears before the definition of a common purpose and an ultimate end for all forms of activity. Law and government can, it is asserted, be of real value only in so far as they conduce to the realization of the purpose of each and every individual soul. Therefore, till the Hildebrandine school of the 12th century, the emperor becomes a mere sword in the Church's hand, a chief of police, a justiciarius under the Pope. Any secular government that claims independence of the Church can base its claim only on assertion that the end of man can be realized in this life and in relation to mere earthly and temporal needs. At the least, it must claim real value for the things of this world. But no real value attaches to the things of this world in themselves. Real values are spiritual and transcendental. The claim of secular powers to independence is blasphemy and of the devil. This is 12th century doctrine. In the 13th century, men begin to see things differently. Aquinas finds a real basis for secular government in the fact that peace and order and a certain minimum of material well-being are necessities of the spiritual life on earth. Yet he too insists that government has no meaning or value except in so far as it conduces to that apprehension of God which is the end of man's existence. The medieval empire was conceived by these thinkers as a thing very different from that which we are accustomed to associate with the word. It was, to them, all but an ecclesiastical institution. Their idea of it involved the conception of a common purpose in human life, and this purpose involved, ultimately at least, an escape from the bonds of the material. The material world was antagonistic in many ways, not in every way, to man's spiritual self-realization. The essential function of government is one of release. The duty of the secular power was to create and maintain conditions favorable to spiritual development. So far from being concerned solely with temporal affairs, it was concerned essentially with spiritual affairs. For this very reason, it was subordinate to the Church. Its business was so to order the temporal as to strengthen man's hold on the eternal. Coming after Aquinas, John of Paris sees no need of an emperor at all, but he sees that secular government has a reason for existence. An emperor or no emperor, all secular government must be directed by the same final purpose. And so we come to the last word in this system of politics, the idea of a world state based on the moral consciousness of mankind and on the recognition of a common end of existence. That ideal world state could be called indifferently in the language of the 12th century res publica generis humani or ecclesia universalis. But granted, the premises, nothing less, will suffice logically or morally, for the purpose is the same everywhere. The end of living is the same for all human beings. The real interests of all men are the same, or rather man has only one real interest. The desire of man is for completeness and for happiness. Neither can be realized here, but so far as realization is possible on earth, it is only in a world state that it is possible. Already in the 14th century, this system of ideas is breaking up. On one side, its metaphysical foundations are being attacked, if not destroyed, by the analytic intellects of Duns Scotus and of Occam. On another, the new national states, territorial and racialized groupings, are emerging to self-consciousness, striving for independence, and drawing men's thoughts more and more to actuality. Gradually, it is becoming apparent that Christendom is not a unity, that in fact there is no Christendom at all. It had always been so. Christendom was a figment born of the incurable optimism of humanity. Already in Italy is going on that separation of politics from morals which finds verbal expression in Machiavelli. The process goes on, till in the 17th century Hobbes is able to declare that the natural relation of any two states is war, and that natural law is simply that law of reason which forbids a man to do anything that impairs or will impair his security in the pursuit of pleasurable sensation. Gradually the whole system was sapped and crumbled at its foundation, the belief, that is, in a natural law of obligation. Though at the end of the 17th century Locke still believes in natural law, the belief was being replaced. There was an increasing tendency to get rid of the transcendental element in morals, and to fall back on some form of utilitarianism. So also there was an increasing tendency to reject the idea of a transcendental purpose or end of human existence, and to seek a sufficient purpose for life within the walls of matter. Mechanical explanations of life and the universe had their vogue, and along with all that went an increase of pure skepticism. But there was always reaction, and it has, I think, strengthened in the last century. We have still with us a philosophy of the absolute good. To say that the medieval conception of natural law and of a transcendental purpose in life was demonstrably false would, I think, be demonstrably silly. There has been for a long time past a tendency to return to the medieval conception of society as an expression of the moral consciousness. Equally is there now a tendency to turn toward the idea of a world state. We are perhaps drawing nearer to the thought of the Middle Ages. I suggest not merely that any separation of politics from ethics is fatal, but that a society which has lost belief in the validity of its own moral intuitions rests on rotting foundations. I suggest further that the idea that government must be directed to a recognized common and ultimate end, and refer to a standard of absolute values, or be radically purposeless, is perfectly sound. The end perhaps need not transcend this world. It may be possible to find a purpose referring only to this world that will satisfy the soul of man, but I suggest that no such end has yet been found. We can strip from the medieval system of ideas that I have tried to define and outline all that is not essential to it. We can eliminate the church altogether and it will still stand logically coherent. It is a question, it is perhaps the question, whether we can also eliminate God. It may be that our civilization is slipping down toward chaos and disillusion. Personally, I am under the impression that things are not so bad as that yet, but I am well aware that no man's impression on such a matter is worth much. But I do believe that we may yet learn from the medieval thinkers. We need to consider what we, the state, are at, and why we are at it. Man never has known what he wants, but he won't be happy till he gets it. J. W. Allen. End of section 23. End of medieval contributions to modern civilization.